thank you so much for coming on, by the way.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
But yeah, so I started this sexy jobs thing. I graduated last January and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And I also could not find a job for the life of me. I had so many coffee chats. And then this idea of a sexy job came up because I have friends with very cool, interesting jobs. That end up being that's like their like the coolest thing about them is their job, which I think is very rare. Especially, I don't know, I feel like the majority of my friends are in like banking or law and they're like accountants and it's just like we don't want to talk about their work. And so I met a lot of people who had really cool jobs. I was going to write something about it and I was like, I have so many people that I want to talk to that I'm like, I
Yeah,
can make this a series. So yeah, I ask people with cool jobs for career advice, basically.
great. That's really cool.
I always start with the same thing. So how would you define a sexy job?
Okay, so it's really funny when you first reach out to me with, the sexy jobs name. I don't know if you're aware, but I don't know if it even still exists, but there's this old website that was called like sexyjobs.com. And but it's all like sex work adjacent type of sexy
Here's the
jobs.
thing, when I tell people that I was like, oh, like I run a like I have this like series on sexy jobs, I get like a range of reactions, and especially when I'm talking to like serious adults,
Yeah.
and they're quite interested in what that entails.
Yeah. But no, I love the term sexy jobs because it is I do think what I have is a sexy job. And uh perhaps the defining thing is a sexy job is a job that you do want to talk about at parties and that people do want to hear about at parties. And I personally am somebody who it's so funny. I was watching Lost last night where somebody says that they like owned like a mineral mining company and they're like joking like, "Oh yeah, everybody wants to talk to me at cocktail parties." And it's like, "What do you mean? If I met somebody who owned a mineral mining company, I would have so many questions for you. Like I'm desperate to talk to you." So I think that I'm curious about everybody's job. Is that's what I mean with that. But yeah, for me, I feel like my job is sexy in that they are curious about it. But also, my job, not specifically just, working with Playboy, which is obviously a big part of it, but being a writer and everything is inseparable really from who I am as a person. And, I don't really see it entirely as like, this is my job and then this is who I am. I see it as, I just, it kind of encompasses my whole identity. And whether that's sexy or not, I don't know. But there's certainly a lot of intrigue associated with my job. Um, so for me, that's what kind of makes the job sexy is a bit of intrigue.
I think you also have maybe the sexiest workplace. I'm like, I have a lot of writer friends, and I think what you said of you can't really, when I thought I was going to go into like a normal corporate, like my plan was to go into like management consulting, which my friends who now work in that, they're like, best thing that happened to you is that didn't work out. They're miserable. Uh, some of them, I don't want to like
Yeah.
say they're, but I think like you can very much have an identity outside, like you have your work persona and then you walk away and that kind of like clocks off. And I feel like if you're doing something that's creative and you don't really have that separation, and even your colleagues are also your friends, and I was like trying to figure out how to navigate that. Of my first editor was also a really good friend of mine, and I'm like, can I text her about work? Like if we were just working together, I wouldn't have her personal phone number. So I I feel like that's so fair of like you don't really have that much of a separation.
Yeah, for better or worse. I definitely often wish I could like really clock out and feel disconnected from my work. And while I do still work like a 9 to 5 type of structure, I don't really ever feel detached from it. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of pros and cons of that kind of work dynamic.
And how did you end up at Playboy?
So my origin story with Playboy. is I have spent the last 4 years or so freelancing. And through all of that, I'd kind of established a solid enough name for myself as like a sex and culture writer to where when Playboy was relaunching, they stopped publishing the magazine in early 2020, pre-pandemic actually 2020. Um, when they were relaunching around a year and a half ago, the editor associated with it at the time contacted me asking if I had any freelance pitches. And so I wrote a story for the relaunch issue. And then I was getting coffee a few months later with the editor at the time and talking about what my next story could be. And I kind of threw it out there. It was like, if you need any editorial help, love to throw my name out there. And he was sort of like, actually, like that's perfect. Like I do need somebody and I don't want to go through like a big hiring process. That's great. And so kind of everything just really fell into place with that by like offering myself up
Hmm.
in that way. And yeah, I've been on a contract with Playboy for a year now.
And like, what was your awareness of Playboy growing up? I feel like there's such a. I was on the phone with my mother and grandmother like 20 minutes before we got on this call. And my grandma was like, yeah, like your grandpa had this like basket of Playboy magazines that would like be in the bathroom. And I was like, wait, I spent my morning like looking through like old Playboy spreads. And I was like, where
Yeah.
do these magazines go? Like who inherited those?
Yeah.
But I think my kind of awareness of the magazine growing up was so it was very much like tits for a while. And then I think I went down the lane of like, I studied literature. There were so many people who kind of got their start there. And so that's a bit that like people aren't super aware of. And so
Right.
kind of growing up, what was your awareness of both the magazine and the brand? And then also as like a sex and culture writer, I feel like that's a pretty big kind of name.
Yeah, yeah. Growing up, I think I probably had similar associations of, naked women. It was also like as a child in like the early 2000s, there's a lot of, like Spencer's Gifts, like Hot Topic type of Playboy Bunny logo stuff. There was Girls Next Door on TV. So a very like it looking back, I have this very like nostalgic Y2K imagery of Playboy. Um, and then once I reached sort of high school age and was really interested in being a writer, I think that's where I developed a bit more of an understanding of Playboy as a literary entity. Was really into like Hunter S. Thompson in high school, and uh, would have said that like working for Playboy was absolutely my dream job, and certainly thought that throughout college. Um, and then my first job, my first boss was a former Playboy editor, um, and that made me feel as though like the bridge had been burned, sort of, that like Playboy was always going to be out of my reach because I was like building my early career with somebody who was formerly from Playboy, and it would have kind of been like a disaffiliation with my first boss to like ever work there. And then of course, 2020 came around and Playboy stopped publishing, so I felt as though the the dream had maybe died. But I always loved Playboy. I throughout that history of ups and downs, I have had old issues of Playboy, old Playboy merchandise. I have some things that belong to my grandfather. I have like these little coasters still in the package that have the Playboy Bunny logo on it. I have these like cocktail swizzle sticks that belong to my grandfather. And so I always still just always really loved the iconography, loved the writing, um, felt very fond feelings towards Playboy. And so, when the opportunity came around, I obviously had to jump. Yeah. And it's it's really hard to like even kind of like digest the reality that like, oh, I do now work for Playboy magazine. And it's one of those things where it's like, if only I could tell, my 17-year-old self, my 21-year-old self, my 25-year-old self, even, that this would be the case. What a delight that would be.
And I feel like since you came back like with the relaunch, how do you feel? Where does Playboy fit? And now I feel like we're a little bit like desensitized, and also like everything is so readily available. I find that like again, my morning research of looking through like old centerfolds, and I'm like, it's very tasteful and artistic, and I think very different from what we kind of associate with
Yes.
like nudity and pornographic imagery nowadays. And that's
Yes.
like I was looking through that, and I was so kind of shocked by how different it is to kind of the first time I had like a pop-up, and I was like my first interaction with that kind of imagery was so different. Um, and I think kind of where do you see Playboy fitting in, but both in that aspect and then also like, I was reading through the articles, and I'm like, it is somewhere that like I go to Playboy for the writing. Um, but I'm aware I'm like in a very specific bubble, and my media diet is very tailored. So like where do you see it falling into like the cultural space now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, there's always been the joke of like, I read Playboy for the articles. And it's a joke because, there's naked women in the magazine, but it's 100% true. Like you said, like all of like the literary greats of the 20th century got their start in Playboy. And so like genuinely people do read Playboy for the articles, and they also enjoy the pictures of naked women.
What do you mean there's
And
naked women in Playboy? I never even caught that.
it's it's really it's such a funny dynamic because you're totally right. Like it's print nudity, especially in the form that it's displayed in Playboy specifically, where it's very sensual, and it's not gynecological, I would say. No disrespect to like Hustler or, actual like pornographic print magazines, but it's just a totally different entity. And I think that looking through both old issues and new issues, it really solidifies in my mind that there is like a need for that type of middle ground, erotic content where it's approachable and accessible without being jarring or, over familiarizing. It's it's a much softer landing into nudity than
Hmm.
what a lot of us got with internet pornography. Um, that's for sure.
And like
Um,
that was jarring. Like I don't think I would
yeah,
have been traumatized opening Playboy. I was traumatized as a teen.
yes. I definitely have a memory of like opening up a magazine when I was younger. I don't know if it was Playboy or not, and like opening up and like seeing boobs and be like, and being really like embarrassed that I saw that, but it's absolutely nothing compared to the feeling of like, I like some in middle school, like some boy like tricked me to going onto a porn website. It was called like Panda something. So I was like, oh, there's gonna be panda. There's gonna be pandas on this website. That was not pandas. And that was a horror. That was like it terrified every cell in my body. Um, anyway, but what's funny is like now that I've looked through so much Playboy, uh, especially going through some of like the older pictorials and everything, it really surprised me how, despite it being tame in today's context and also in its own historical context, it's tame. I mean, there's been like hardcore pornography for a while now. Um, it's funny how looking at this stuff, there's still like it's still quite like titillating, even in its subtlety, and perhaps maybe because of its
Because of
subtlety.
it. Mhm.
Yes. And so I think that's like a really interesting dynamic in the contemporary context, is that there's still very much like a less is more effect.
Mhm.
with this kind of erotic content, and which I think it, again just goes to show like the value of it and its longevity.
And do you think we are, I think, more opening to talking about sex and sexuality, and now on Playboy, but also like what you're writing in other publications? Do you think people are generally more open to having these conversations and things are less taboo, or is it more of you end up in very specific circles where these things are just more openly discussed?
I think I'm in a pretty unique position where I like oscillate between these two worlds of like very sexually open and then also like there's so much sexual conservatism on the internet, whether it's from young people who feel that they came up in like an ultra pornographic world and now want to reject that, or if it's, you know, just like politically conservative people, whatever else. There's definitely like the pendulum, I think, has swung with pornography for a lot of people where, you know, a decade ago, there was a lot of talk of like sex positivity and, you know, like porn is good and all of that, to where there's a real opposite attitude amongst a lot of people today. And with that, I think Playboy has kind of, you know, like that type of the type of erotic content in Playboy has been swept up in that to where people I think don't really realize that there is such a difference between like print erotica and hardcore video pornography. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic to navigate today of like people people need to be reintroduced to the value and existence of this type of material, and kind of need to be refamiliarized with the idea that like this is something different.
Slightly now on like a personal end, and I write a lot about my personal life, and I'm aware like your writing is not that, but you are writing a lot about sex and relationships. Do you find that has that ever like affected your personal relationships, and how have you kind of navigated the crossover between your work and then your personal life?
Yeah, I think that it's been really important to me to have kind of a line in the sand of not really talking too much about my own personal life.
Mm.
And like I'm actually engaged to be married, and I don't really
Mm,
like don't really
congrats.
I keep a lot of my personal life relatively private online. But so all that's to say, given that I'm engaged, I've been relatively successful in my own personal romantic life, because I have just a very supportive partner who's really been willing to navigate all of this with me. And I think keeping some of it private has been crucial to that, in that like it doesn't have to like reflect on him in a broad, like in a public broad sense.
Hmm.
But it's always something like I'm very embarrassed about like his parents reading my work, but they're so supportive and they read everything that I write. They're both like paid subscribers to my Substack, which like I find humiliating, but it's also
Secure the
like, you
bag.
know, it's so beautiful that they want to do that, and and that they love me and I love them. Um and you know, same with like my mom and everything. That can be there's always like a little bit of embarrassment when your family reads your work, whatever the work is about, but especially when it's about sex. But I'm lucky to kind of, it's not even that like on an immediate social level, I probably exist in like a very like sexually open world, but I would also say like I'm lucky that the the adults in my life are also like they're certainly not like, you know, free love hippies or anything like that, but they're just like they're open and curious and understanding. And I think they're all also appreciative that I don't really write about my personal life in that. Um, One thing that's always kind of struck me though is that I do encounter people out in the wild who know that I'm a sex writer or whatever, and take that as like a sign that I must be just like completely sexually available, like no flirtation even required. And it's like, what are you what are you talking? It's really that part's bizarre. It's like, oh, this woman's like associated with sex in any capacity. That must mean that she is like she's ready to go. Um, that's not the case.
And what's it like working for a publication that traditionally has like a very male audience? Um, Even like I was talking to a friend and I was like, oh, I'm talking to a Playboy editor. And they're like, oh, how did you meet him? And I was like, actually, it's a her.
Uh.
And AFM, like the Field magazine as well. And I've like met their editors and they're both women. And I'm like, I don't know, in my head, I'm like, I didn't have that, like, I didn't make that association. But with a lot of people, I think also like this very distinct image of like Hugh Hefner and the Playboy
Yeah.
bunnies, and it's it has a primarily male audience, or at least I would expect that. What's it like working in that environment?
Well, it's really interesting because right now, I would say media in general is like a very women dominated field. And that's almost a problem in a way. Like I think that there should be more men back in like the magazine space, but right now it's very women dominated. And you know, obviously like that's great for me and for the women in media that I love, but like we do I think it could become a problem for men's media writ large if, you know, everything
If there's
written
no
for
men at the
men.
table.
Yeah. Yeah. Like but it's interesting that people still have that association. Um Writing for a male audience, which is something that I with like, you know, my Substack or whatever, I don't really, and even with Playboy, like Playboy does have a strong female readership. Um I it's really always like people are going to put a lot of their own baggage about gender upon that dynamic. And there's a lot of times where, by virtue of me being a woman writing about men in any capacity, there's a lot of assumptions there that, like, I am anti men often. Like, it's very hard to, like, there's plenty of people who see a woman criticizing any aspect of masculinity, like if I'm writing about Andrew Tate or something like that, and how like that's harmful to men. People take that, there's people who take that as an attack on masculinity writ large and think like I hate men. And it's like the reality is that I really love men. Like to the point where also I think a lot of women like accuse me of liking them too much and like, you know, to the detriment of women. And there's so much back and forth there. Like
Hmm.
basically men often think that I'm too like favorable towards women. Women think I'm too favorable towards men.
You can't win.
I can't win. I'm really trying to be favorable towards everybody. But yeah, but with all of that though, writing for a male audience, there is always kind of like when you are a woman writing for a male audience, there's also going to be like a little bit of like probably sexual projection there where I'm like I'm a woman who's visible online and writing about sex, and so that's kind of like that itself is like a titillating prospect for people, I think. And I've kind of had to I've used that, you know, to my advantage in some ways in my career. Like I don't really mind that, you know, my womanliness has like worked in my favor in my career, but
I
it's
feel like
definitely
it's
something.
also how you look. That is going to play into how, and I've had this conversation
Yeah.
with so many people, and I'm like, I can't live like the way that I look has definitely opened certain doors, and also like the way that people are going to engage with my work, even though
Yeah.
I'm like, it's not my face, but like, it's not a people are reading my work because they think I'm hot. But I think, the way that they engage with your writing and how you look, just you can't really separate those two.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, it is like, it would be awesome if more people read my work because they thought I was hot. Like, I would be totally okay with that dynamic, but that's not really how the internet
It's not
works.
how it works, unfortunately. Like I would be posting more thirst traps if that was the case.
But, and I think whatever field people work in, attractiveness does play a role in it. Like unfortunately, like clavicular is right about that part that like being attractive does like help whatever field you're working in. But it's obviously not the end all be all.
And what would you say is like the hardest or like the biggest challenge you have in your career right now?
Um, that's a very interesting question. Sort of it, figuring out what paths I want to take. I'm very interested in writing a book at some point, and that's like such a big hurdle and a big undertaking. Um, yeah, kind of like just separating out like where my focuses are right now, and you know, sometimes it's very difficult to decide like, is this story that I want to write a fit for Playboy, or is it better suited for just me ripping it on my Substack or whatever else? That's kind of one of the other inherent things of being a writer is that like there's rarely one firm location for your work.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, kind of sorting out my energies right now is probably my personal biggest challenge.
And what advice would you give for someone who is wanting to go down the same path? And this is the bit where I like milk it for myself. So I'm like, if you were 23 again,
Yeah, yeah.
what would you tell your 23-year-old self? Or like what was the best advice you got when you were kind of starting your career?
So when I was when I was 23, I was writing 2 articles a day for this publication called Mel Magazine. And at the time, I sort of felt like it was torture, and I was writing about things that I didn't always want to be writing about. I was just taking assignments. I was doing like a lot of like service journalism. But the routine of that, doing your reps as a writer is critical. And especially if you're a writer who's sort of like, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't always know what I wanted to write about.
Okay.
And that's like I think that's kind of a common theme for if you're especially if like you're a nonfiction writer. Um it's sometimes I still don't know what I want to write about. Like there's plenty of things that still interest me besides like sexual gender related things. Um but getting those reps in really helped me first figure out what I enjoyed writing about most and what made most sense for my beat and what like I felt most passionate about when I was writing. But then it also just makes you a much better writer to write as much as possible. So that's a big part of my advice is like if you want to be a writer, you do unfortunately just have to like do it, and that can suck and can be really hard, especially right now when there are so few places that like there's so few jobs out there where you can you know have a livable wage writing 2 articles a day like as like your full-time job. Like those kinds of gigs are really hard to come by right now.
Even just I've spoken to so many friends of like the luxury of having an editor and having like
Hmm.
an editor who was going to make your writing better and like push you to do better. It's a
That's
lost
surprising.
art of
Yes.
like having, I will say like having a good editor makes a world of difference. And I tell people I'm like, yeah, like my Substack is it's that. It's like me getting my reps and I get to like write about whatever I want, but it's also objectively not my best writing because I'm the only person looking through it.
Right. Yeah, no, that is a big factor. Like being edited as a young writer is such a huge privilege, and I wish there was just a better climate for that. And um yeah, I mean another like practical piece of advice I would give people is to like sign up for all of like the like open call for pitches types of newsletters. Like there's one called Study Hall, that I think is like one of the best sources of information of like what places are looking for writing right now. And it might take a very long time to, properly craft a pitch that actually gets accepted, but that's kind of the only way to do it is to to pitch and pitch and pitch until something sticks. And until you can properly build your portfolio from there. But with time, with freelancing and with pitching around, you will eventually find a dynamic that works for you, whether it's an editor you like working with, or a balance of how much effort it takes to produce this work and get paid for it in a way that is still allows you to exist and not burn yourself out. um yeah, I would say basically you have to kind of like turn over every stone if like you want to be a writer in the beginning, and well, often not even just in the beginning, often throughout your whole career as a
Forever.
writer. That's probably also my other piece of advice is like you gotta really want to do it. Like that's when people want to be writers and are asking for advice, it's really like first like let's check like
How
you
much
can't
do you
imagine.
want this?
Yeah, you can't really see yourself doing much else, or like you can't go forth with the rest of your career without knowing that you at least gave it a shot.
The amount of people who are like, if you want anything else, do that instead. Like, is there anything else you would rather do? And I'm like, I'm not doing it for the money. I'm not doing it because it's glamorous. And I'm like, well, it's keeping me like it's the integrity is there because I'm like, I have no ulterior motive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, and the other thing is that you can be a writer and like you can enjoy all of like the spoils of like knowing you're a writer and still be somebody who only gets to like publish something a couple times a year ultimately,
Mhm.
or like at least in another publication where you're being edited or whatever else. Like it's it's totally fine and doesn't make anybody less of a writer to like also have to do something else, especially if you're a young person trying to get your footing. Like you actually probably should do something else, and also those experiences will make you a better writer because they'll give you other avenues of information. And it makes it a lot easier to build your beat and discover your niche as a writer if you've like got something else going on.
And for anyone who might want to pitch Playboy, what would be your advice?
I would say for digital stories, it the biggest thing is like make it sound like something a man would want to read. That's a really difficult part right now, honestly, is I get a lot of great pitches that feel like they should be more in a women's magazine or a queer magazine. They're not exactly a men's magazine type of pitch. And that is still like while Playboy has evolved as a brand, and we are definitely still writing, stories that are interesting to women. There's obviously an overlap. There's queer men read Playboy. Uh, we still have to be focused on a male readership. And besides that, hitting that tone properly, also not being too. I'm really interested in stories that don't, even if it's geared towards a male audience, or not too like strictly political one way or the other. I like stories that have nuance in their angles. Um, but then say for that, like all the traditional pitch advice applies. Like, give me a good headline, give me the who, what, where, when, and why in a paragraph. Tell me how many words you think it is. Your kind of your timeline thing, like get all the practical matters out of the way. Give me a little bit about who you are. Nothing too crazy. But above all, if you want to pitch for Playboy,
A man needs
please
to read it.
please make it something that a man could hypothetically want to read.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.